It was supposed to be a routine Supreme Court hearing, legal briefs, structured arguments, and the steady rhythm of courtroom formality. But nobody expected sparks to fly like they did when former Florida Attorney General Pam Bondi stepped into the chamber. Facing off against Justice Sonia Sotomayor in a landmark case, Bondi didn't just survive the heat. She turned it into a spotlight. The marble silence of the Supreme Court was broken by the clerk's voice. Now hearing federal immigration oversight versus state of Florida. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. This case was high-profile, politically charged, and no less than a referendum on state power versus federal control. And at the heart of it stood Pam Bondi, fiery, composed, and famously unshakable. She took her place at the petitioner's table, flanked by two junior attorneys, her posture as rigid and upright as the courtroom pillars. Across from her sat the justices, black robes, piercing eyes, and a reputation for scrutiny. Justice Sotomayor, in particular, leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Bondi with quiet calculation. As Bondi began her opening statement, citing precedents and constitutional clauses with practiced precision, Justice Sotomayor interjected sharply. "Counsel," she said, her tone cool and clipped, "are you suggesting that Florida's interpretation of immigration law supersedes federal authority established in Arizona versus United States?" Bondi didn't blink. "Not supersedes, Your Honor. Compliments. When federal enforcement fails to act, states must have a mechanism to protect their citizens." Sotomayor raised an eyebrow. "So, you're comfortable ignoring federal supremacy when it suits your political position?" That was the moment the room shifted. Gasps were muffled. Pens paused mid-note. The tension was undeniable. The justice wasn't just questioning a legal argument. She was testing Pam herself. Bondi, however, didn't flinch. She took one small step forward and replied, calm but firm. "With respect, Your Honor, I'm here to argue law, not politics. But if we must speak of precedent, might I remind the court that it is the inactivity of federal enforcement that has created a legal vacuum. Florida didn't create the void. We're just not willing to let our communities suffer inside it." Sotomayor narrowed her eyes. "You think the court exists to solve political vacuums?" "I believe the court exists," Bondi replied without missing a beat, "to ensure the Constitution applies even when Washington looks away." The courtroom stiffened again. Not out of disrespect, but out of recognition. Bondi wasn't just defending a case. She was making a point the justices couldn't easily dismiss. Chief Justice Roberts turned slightly toward Sotomayor, his eyes unreadable. Justice Alito scribbled something quickly on a notepad. Justice Kagan leaned back, her expression more curious than skeptical now. And just like that, Bondi had shifted the tone. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Justice Sotomayor wasn't used to being rebutted so directly, especially not by someone standing at the podium below her. She folded her hands and tilted her head, her voice dipping into something colder. "Ms. Bondi," she said slowly, "you use the term legal vacuum as justification. But isn't that just an elegant way of saying Florida wants to enforce its own immigration laws because it disagrees with federal policy?" Pam Bondi leaned slightly into the microphone, her voice crisp. "Respectfully, Justice Sotomayor, we're not in disagreement with policy. We're compensating for its absence. We don't claim federal turf. We're defending our own." That's when it happened, the line that would make headlines. Sotomayor narrowed her gaze and said, "This isn't a campaign stop, Ms. Bondi. You're not here to deliver applause lines." Pam didn't look away. Instead, she calmly flipped a page in her notes and replied, "And with respect, Your Honor, I came prepared to argue law. But if the bench prefers political theater, I assure you, I won't be upstaged." The courtroom froze. A few reporters dropped their pens. One of the clerks audibly gasped. Sotomayor leaned back. There was silence, deep and heavy. Even Chief Justice Roberts gave Bondi a sidelong glance, as if to say, "You just stepped on sacred ground." But Bondi stood rooted in place, unfazed. She knew what she was doing, and more importantly, she knew what she was defending. Justice Kagan broke the tension with a question about jurisdiction. shifting the spotlight momentarily. But it was clear. The air had changed. During a recess, whispers filled the corridors of the Supreme Court. Did she just say that to Sotomayor? She's either brilliant or reckless. She's gutsy, that's for sure. Back inside, as proceedings resumed, Justice Sotomayor returned with a sharper edge. Let's go back to Prince versus United States. You cite it repeatedly, yet it's been distinguished in later rulings. Are you suggesting the 10th Amendment grants Florida immunity from federal non-enforcement? Pam raised her eyes. No, Your Honor. I'm suggesting the 10th Amendment doesn't permit Florida to be paralyzed by federal indifference. When the federal government retreats, the Constitution does not require states to fold their hands and watch harm unfold. That was the moment a low murmur rolled through the press box. One reporter mouthed, "Wow, Pam Bondi wasn't just arguing legal theory. She was reframing the conversation, turning defense into offense." Sotomayor, still composed, asked one final question before closing her line of inquiry. And where exactly do you draw the line between complementing federal law and contradicting it? Bondi's reply came like a lightning bolt. At the Constitution, Your Honor. Always at the Constitution. It landed like a gavel. The mood in the Supreme Court chamber had changed. The justices, usually a monolithic wall of inquiry, were now split, not in opinion but in attention. More eyes were focused on Pam Bondi than anyone expected, including Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And that didn't sit well with the justice. Sotomayor pressed forward. Ms. Bondi, you speak confidently about constitutional limits, but what you're proposing, state-led immigration enforcement, echoes dangerous precedents. We've seen where that leads. Discrimination, selective policing, and communities living in fear. Pam paused, glanced at her notes, then set them aside altogether. This time, she spoke not as a lawyer, but as a woman who'd seen things firsthand. I've sat across from mothers in Florida who lost their children to violent crimes committed by individuals who slipped through the cracks because no one acted. Not IC, not local authorities. The system froze in place while tragedy moved forward. Sotomayor leaned back, her arms crossed. And I've also stood beside immigrant families, Bondi added quickly, her voice firm, whose only fear wasn't the law, but being forgotten by it. Enforcing immigration policy doesn't mean dehumanizing people. It means ensuring everyone, citizen and immigrant, is treated with equal protection. That quieted the courtroom again. It wasn't rhetoric. It was experience. And that struck deeper than citations. Justice Breyer leaned in, uncharacteristically curious. So you believe Florida is filling in a gap, not creating one? Pam nodded. I believe the Constitution gives us the right and responsibility to act when silence endangers lives. And then, almost theatrically, Justice Sotomayor made a move that would be remembered in legal circles for years. She pulled out a handwritten note from her folder, something not part of the official record, and read aloud. The state should never outpace the union in defining justice. Do you agree with that statement, Ms. Bondi? Pam's eyes narrowed. I agree, she said slowly. That states should never abandon justice because the union drags its feet. We are not outpacing Washington. We're reminding it of its duty. That line, reminding it of its duty, became the headline before the gavel even hit. From the back of the courtroom, a former appellate clerk whispered to his colleague. She just flipped the narrative. That's not advocacy, that's strategy. Meanwhile, Sotomayor offered a small, almost imperceptible smirk. She had tried to corner Bondi, and instead watched her command the moment. Still, the justice wasn't finished. You speak with conviction, Ms. Bondi, she said softly. But conviction alone does not win cases. Pam smiled for the first time. No, Your Honor, she said, voice calm and razor-sharp. But the law does, and on that I'm standing tall. By mid-morning, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of quiet jurisprudence. It felt like an arena. Journalists were scribbling furiously. Clerks leaned in with held breath. And Justice Sonia Sotomayor, typically a model of composure, was visibly unsettled. She adjusted her glasses, her tone now edged with something more personal than procedural. "Ms. Bondi," she began, "I've read your arguments, but your premise depends on the assumption that the federal government is failing. Isn't that a dangerous road to walk? If every state gets to decide what counts as failure, we unravel the very union we swore to uphold." Pam didn't hesitate. "I'm not suggesting subjective interpretation, Your Honor," she replied evenly. "I'm pointing to factual inaction. Arrest records. ICE detainers ignored. Border Patrol overstretched and underempowered. If this isn't systemic failure, what is?" Sotomayor opened her mouth to reply, but Justice Gorsuch beat her to it. "And if the federal system is broken," he said, voice measured, "isn't it the duty of the states to step in, provided they do not violate federal law?" For a split second, Sotomayor looked genuinely caught off guard. Pam seized the moment. "Exactly, Justice Gorsuch. That's what Florida is doing, preserving order where federal paralysis creates chaos." The entire room sensed it. A shift in power. Bondi had not just held her ground. She had started swaying the bench. Justice Thomas, normally reserved, scribbled something and passed it to Roberts. Roberts read it, lips pressing into a thin line. Even Kagan looked intrigued. Then came a moment nobody expected. Justice Sotomayor leaned forward again, but this time, she paused. Instead of questioning, she said, "Ms. Bondi, you argue with clarity. I disagree with your position strongly, but I cannot deny the thoroughness of your preparation." Pam nodded. "That's all I ask, Your Honor. Let the argument stand on its legal merit, not on assumptions about motive." It was subtle, but unmistakable, an acknowledgement from the bench, one that rarely, if ever, comes mid-hearing. A ripple of realization moved through the gallery. Bondi hadn't just held her own against one of the fiercest minds on the court. She had earned her respect. In the final minutes of her time, Bondi turned to the broader issue. When laws are not enforced, they become suggestions. And when citizens lose faith in enforcement, they lose faith in justice itself. Florida is not rebelling. We're reminding Washington that when it stops leading, the states don't stop protecting. She stepped back from the podium, voice quiet but resonant. "I rest, Your Honors." For a long, silent moment, the courtroom sat still, and then Chief Justice Roberts spoke. "Thank you, counsel. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments." The gavel struck, but the real impact, that had already been delivered by Pam Bondi, who left the courtroom not as a former attorney general, but as a legal force that stunned the highest court in the land. Outside the courtroom, the steps of the Supreme Court had turned into a frenzy. Camera crews lined the plaza. Pundits were already calling it the Bondi breakdown. Not because she failed, but because she broke through assumptions, broke through the formality, and broke into national attention in a way no one anticipated. Inside, whispers echoed across marble hallways. Court clerks exchanged glances. Junior attorneys huddled near corners, replaying quotes on their phones. Even veteran constitutional scholars admitted it. They hadn't seen a state representative handle oral arguments like that in years. As day two commenced, the room was packed. Justice Sotomayor entered last, her demeanor visibly cooled. More cautious, but far from retreating. She still had cards to play. Pam Bondi returned to the floor, this time for closing arguments. She carried no binder, no notepad, just a single-page summary in her hand. As she approached the podium, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't even glance at the justices. Instead, she began by speaking directly to the record. "When the Constitution was written," she said, "the framers didn't expect perfection from government. That's why they distributed power across branches, across states, so no failure would go unchecked." She looked up now directly at Justice Sotomayor. "This case isn't about rebellion. It's about responsibility. When the federal government retreats from its duties, the 10th Amendment doesn't tie the hands of states. It frees them to act." Sotomayor raised a hand. "Counsel, where does this freedom end? If each state decides the federal government is retreating, don't we risk turning the nation into a patchwork of laws, fragmented and conflicting? Bondi didn't flinch. That's not what Florida proposes. We don't seek independence. We seek action, cooperation, not contradiction. But we will not stand still while federal silence enables suffering. Justice Barrett cut in now for the first time in the case. Would you concede, Ms. Bondi, that states can act only so far as federal law permits? Yes, Bondi nodded. But I would also argue that when federal law is dormant, enforcement non-existent, the states are left with no roadmap. In that void, we must act lawfully, proportionally, and above all, constitutionally. The courtroom was hushed again. Not out of respect, but awe. Pam wasn't outmaneuvering the justices. She was guiding them inch by inch toward a legal logic too clear to ignore. And then, for the first time since the hearing began, Justice Sotomayor asked a question that sounded less like a challenge and more like curiosity. If the court were to side with Florida, she asked, what guardrails do you propose to prevent states from overstepping? Pam's answer was simple: judicial review, congressional oversight, and the moral courage to act only when Washington refuses to. Silence. Justice Breyer looked down at his notes, lips pursed. Gorsuch nodded faintly. Even Justice Kagan, ever skeptical, appeared thoughtful. Pam stepped back once more. Florida didn't come here to pick a fight. We came here to defend our people, not in defiance of Washington, but in place of its absence. Then she paused, for just a second, and said with quiet force, "Thank you, Your Honors." The Chief Justice looked across the bench. The court will now consider its opinion. We are adjourned. The gavel struck, but it couldn't drown out the thunder that had just passed through the room. The Supreme Court chamber emptied slowly, but no one truly left the building unchanged. Reporters outside fumbled to keep up with the narrative. It wasn't just about immigration anymore. It was about one woman, a former state attorney general, who walked into the most powerful legal arena in the country and held her ground with brilliance, grit, and an unshakable belief in the Constitution. That night, legal commentators across the political spectrum took to television and streaming panels. Liberal analyst Marcus Laramie, known for his sharp criticism of conservative legal minds, simply said, "I disagree with Pam Bondi's argument, but I can't deny she made it masterfully. You don't have to win." The clip of her sparring with Justice Sotomayor, especially the moment she said, "But if the bench prefers political theater, I assure you, I won't be upstaged," went viral within hours. Social media exploded. Hashtags like #Bondi vs. Sotomayor and #Courtroom Clash trended nationwide. And inside the court, something even more telling was happening. A memo circulated among the justices' clerks. It wasn't part of the official opinion-writing process, but it carried weight. The memo acknowledged the effectiveness of Bondi's oral arguments, suggesting her structure, tone, and strategy could be studied in future legal training. That kind of recognition? Almost unheard of. But perhaps the most astonishing moment came a week later. Justice Sotomayor, speaking at an academic conference at NYU, was asked directly about the hearing. She paused, and then she said this: "Pam Bondi is a formidable advocate. We disagreed vehemently, but the court is stronger when it hears arguments like hers, arguments that challenge us not just to rule but to reflect." It was the kind of praise that echoed far beyond the classroom. Back in Florida, Bondi returned home not just to applause, but to something far rarer in today's political world: respect from both sides. Her calm in the face of provocation, her unwavering adherence to law over theater, her refusal to be intimidated, even when the person across from her wore a robe stitched with the highest authority in the land. As for the case, the ruling would come 2 months later. A split decision that gave partial victory to Florida but cautioned against future overreach. Yet by then, the verdict had already been delivered by the American people. Pam Bondi hadn't just argued a case. She'd proven beyond politics, beyond partisanship, that in the Supreme Court, the sharpest weapon is not the robe, the bench, or the title. It's the truth, delivered without fear. And in that courtroom, she didn't flinch.